Somewhere beneath the murky canals of Mexico City, there is a creature that should not exist. It smiles constantly, even when it is dying. It can lose its entire heart and grow a new one. It can have its brain cut open and heal without a single scar. And for almost 200 years, scientists studied it, dissected it, bred it by the millions, and still could not explain how it was doing what it was doing. Then, in the last few years, something changed. Researchers finally cracked open the code hiding inside this animal's cells, and what they found is now being called one of the biggest breakthroughs in the history of regenerative medicine. This is the story of the axolotl, the walking fish that isn't a fish, the Mexican salamander that refuses to grow up, and the secret buried inside its DNA that could one day change what happens when you lose a finger, scar a heart, or damage a spinal cord. Before we get to the secret, you need to understand just how strange this animal really is, because most people in the United States only know the axolotl from a video game character or a pink plush toy. The real story is far weirder than that. The axolotl is not from a lab. It is not a hybrid someone invented. It is a real wild salamander that comes from exactly one place on Earth, a shrinking network of canals south of Mexico City called Xochimilco. That is it. There is nowhere else. Not a lake in Canada, not a river in Asia, just one waterlogged remnant of what used to be a giant Aztec lake system. And today, that habitat is so degraded that biologists estimate somewhere between 50 and 1,000 adult axolotls remain in the wild. Read that again. There could be fewer wild axolotls left on the planet than there are people in a small town. Meanwhile, in home aquariums and laboratories around the world, there are millions of them. The species is thriving everywhere except the one place it actually belongs. The name itself carries a story most Americans have never heard. Axolotl comes from Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and it is tied directly to Xolotl, the Aztec god of fire, lightning, deformity, and death, the twin brother of the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl. According to the legend, the gods needed a sacrifice to keep the sun moving across the sky, and Xolotl, terrified of dying, tried to run. He transformed himself into a stalk of corn to hide, then into a maguey plant, and finally, when he could not escape any longer, he threw himself into the lake and became a salamander, a water monster, so he could hide underwater forever. That is what the word axolotl actually means, roughly water monster or water dog. The Aztecs considered this creature sacred, a living god hiding in the canals, and at the exact same time, they ate it. It was both a deity and a delicacy, a paradox that has followed this animal ever since, because right now, in the 21st century, axolotl is still served as food in parts of Mexico, even as conservationists fight to keep the species from vanishing entirely. Now here is where the science gets genuinely bizarre. Most salamanders start life in water and eventually grow up. They lose their gills, their tails change shape, and they crawl out onto land as adults. The axolotl refuses to do this. It hits sexual maturity, it can reproduce, it can live for over 10 years, and it still looks like a baby the entire time. It keeps its feathery external gills. It keeps its tail fin. It keeps its aquatic, larval body for its entire life. Biologists call this neoteny, and in the axolotl, it is almost total. Picture a human being who reaches full adulthood, has children of their own, and still physically looks and lives like an infant. That is essentially what is happening here. And for a long time, nobody could fully explain why. The current understanding centers on their thyroid hormone signaling. In most salamanders, a hormone called thyroxine triggers metamorphosis, the transformation from water-dwelling larva to land-walking adult. In the axolotl, That signaling pathway is essentially switched off under natural conditions, so the transformation command never fires. Scientists have actually forced axolotls to metamorphose in laboratory settings by injecting them with thyroid hormone, and when they do, the animal loses its gills. Its tail changes, and it becomes a land-walking salamander that looks completely different from the pink, smiling creature people recognize. But left alone in the wild, it never grows up. It stays a permanent child of the water. And that permanent childhood turns out to be connected to the real reason scientists have obsessed over this animal for nearly 2 centuries: its regeneration. Here's the fact that made axolotls famous in biology labs worldwide. And it is not an exaggeration. If an axolotl loses a leg, it grows the leg back. Not a stump, not scar tissue. A complete, fully functional leg with the right number of toes, the right bones, the right nerves, the right muscles. In as little as a few weeks. Lose a tail, it grows back. Damage the spinal cord, it repairs. Crush part of the heart, it regenerates working heart muscle. Injure the brain, sections of it heal and regrow. Even parts of the eye can regenerate, and it is not a one-time trick. Researchers have documented individual axolotls regrowing the same limb more than 100 times over their lives with no decline in the quality of the regrowth. Compare that to us. If a human loses a finger, the body's answer is a scar. Permanent, non-functional, done. The axolotl's answer is, give me a few weeks and I will build you a new one from scratch. For decades, this looked like magic. And honestly, it kind of is magic, except it is magic with a mechanism. And finding that mechanism has been one of the great unsolved puzzles in all of biology. The mystery was never just that axolotls could regrow tissue. Other animals can do that to some degree. Starfish regrow arms, lizards regrow tails. But usually badly, usually with limits, usually without perfect precision. The real mystery, the one that stumped researchers for generations, was how the cells at the site of an amputation somehow know exactly what they are supposed to build. If you cut an axolotl's arm at the elbow, the new growth knows to build a hand and not a shoulder. If you cut it at the shoulder, the regrowth builds the entire arm, elbow, wrist, and all in the correct proportions. Somehow cells at the wound site are reading some kind of internal map, some form of positional memory that tells them precisely where in the body they are and precisely what is missing. For most of the last century, nobody could find that map. It was one of biology's most famous unanswered questions. That is finally starting to change, and this is the part of the story that is genuinely new. Most of it discovered in just the last 2 years. Researchers, including a team led by biologist James Monaghan at Northeastern University, found that axolotl limbs are shaped by something called a retinoic acid gradient. Retinoic acid is a molecule related to vitamin A, and inside a regenerating limb, the amount of it is not uniform. It exists in a gradient, higher near the shoulder, lower near the hand, controlled in part by an enzyme called CYP26B1 that breaks the molecule down at different rates depending on location. That gradient acts like a coordinate system. Cells at the wound site sense how much retinoic acid is around them and essentially calculate, based on that concentration, exactly where they are along the length of the limb. High concentration signals, you are near the shoulder, rebuild everything from here outward. Low concentration signals, you are near the hand, only a small structure is missing. This retinoic acid signal switches on other genes, including one called SHOX, a gene that strangely enough also exists in humans and is linked to human height and skeletal growth, which activates the correct developmental blueprint for that exact position in the limb. But that was only part of the puzzle, because a gradient alone does not explain how a severed limb rebuilds its full three-dimensional structure, front to back, top to bottom, thumb side to pinky side. That second piece of the mystery was cracked even more recently. In 2025, a team led by developmental biologist Eli Tanaka at the Institute of Molecular Biotechnology in Vienna published findings in the journal Nature, identifying what they describe as a positional code built around a molecular circuit involving genes called HAN2 and SHH, sonic hedgehog. When an axolotl limb is amputated, stem cells on one side of the wound begin expressing FGF8, while stem cells on the opposite side express SHH, and this creates a kind of internal signaling broadcast across the wound, essentially cells shouting their location to each other. Thumb side versus pinky side, front versus back. Using this circuit, the tissue reconstructs the correct spatial identity of every structure that needs to be rebuilt. Then, just months later in 2025, another research group working with axolotls, zebrafish, and mice discovered that a shared pair of genes, SP6 and SP8, activate in the skin at the wound site across all three of these very different species. Using CRISPR or gene editing, scientists removed SP8 specifically from axolotls, and without it, the animals could no longer properly regenerate limb bones. The fact that mice, which cannot regrow limbs, and axolotls, which can, both carry a version of the same genetic switch, is exactly why this research is now considered so significant. It suggests the tools for regeneration may already exist, dormant, inside human DNA. And the axolotl is showing scientists exactly where to look and how to potentially switch them back on. So when people ask what was the secret, this is the honest answer. Axolotls were never hiding one single secret. They were hiding a layered communication system, a chemical gradient that tells cells where they are, and a genetic circuit that tells those cells what to rebuild once they know their location. Scientists spent nearly 200 years staring at the result, a perfectly regrown limb, without being able to read the internal code producing it. Now, piece by piece, that code is finally being decoded, and the implications go far beyond one strange Mexican salamander. There is more, because the axolotl was hiding several other secrets that most people outside the research world have never heard of. Its genome is enormous. When scientists finally fully sequenced the axolotl genome in 2018, they discovered it contains roughly 32 billion base pairs of DNA. For comparison, the human genome has about 3 billion. That makes the axolotl's genetic blueprint over 10 times the size of ours. And at the time it was sequenced, it was the largest animal genome ever fully assembled. Strangely, this is not because axolotls have more genes than we do. They have a similar number of genes. Instead, their genome is packed with enormous stretches of repetitive, non-coding DNA, whose function is still not fully understood, and researchers suspect some of that mysterious genetic material is directly tied to their regenerative superpowers. They are also remarkably resistant to cancer. Some researchers estimate axolotls are roughly 1,000 times more resistant to tumor formation than mammals are, which sounds almost impossible for an animal whose whole survival strategy depends on massive, rapid, uncontrolled sounding cell growth every time it regrows a limb. You would expect an animal that regenerates constantly to be a cancer factory, because rapid cell division is exactly the kind of process that can go wrong and turn cancerous. Instead, axolotls appear to have tightly regulated systems, including a low metabolic rate, unusual telomere and telomerase activity, and a finely tuned immune response that keep that explosive regenerative growth precisely controlled and shut off once the job is done. Understanding how they pull this off is now an active area of cancer research, because if scientists can learn how an organism can regenerate massive amounts of tissue without a single cell going rogue, that knowledge could reshape how we think about tumor suppression in humans. And then there is one of the strangest facts of all. Axolotls can accept organ and tissue transplants from other axolotls with almost no rejection. In most animals, including humans, the immune system is built specifically to detect and destroy foreign tissue, which is why organ transplants in people require a lifetime of immune suppressing drugs and still carry a real risk of rejection. Axolotls largely sidestep this problem. Skin grafts, limbs, and even other organs can, under research conditions, be transplanted from one axolotl to another with a strikingly high success rate in a way that would be considered close to miraculous in human medicine. Researchers are still working out exactly why, but part of the answer seems tied to that same attenuated, tightly controlled immune response that also helps explain their resistance to cancer and their ability to heal without scarring. There's also a darker, stranger detail buried in axolotl biology that most people never learn. Newly hatched axolotls, when food is scarce, will sometimes bite off and eat the limbs of their own siblings. It sounds brutal, but from an evolutionary standpoint, it barely matters to the victim because that limb will simply grow back. Nature essentially gave this species a built-in forgiveness mechanism for the kind of injury that would be permanently devastating to almost any other animal on Earth. All of this explains why the axolotl has become one of the single most important laboratory animals in modern biology, quietly working behind the scenes in research institutions from Vienna to Boston to Beijing, all chasing the same enormous question. If a salamander can regrow a heart, a spinal cord, and a limb, and do it without scarring, without cancer, and without immune rejection, what exactly is standing in the way of a human being doing the same thing? The honest scientific answer right now is we are getting closer to knowing. The retinoic acid gradient, the HAN2 and SHH positional code, and the shared SP6 and SP8 genetic switch are not just axolotl trivia anymore. They are active blueprints being studied specifically because similar genes already exist inside your own cells, sitting dormant, and researchers now believe that understanding how the axolotl turns them on may eventually teach us how to do the same. And yet, here is the part of this story that should genuinely unsettle you. The one creature on the planet holding some of the biggest unanswered questions in regenerative medicine is, in its actual natural habitat, critically endangered, clinging to survival in a handful of polluted canals on the edge of Mexico City, threatened by invasive fish, urban expansion, and contaminated water. The species that might one day help a human being regrow a damaged organ is, in the wild, closer to disappearing than almost any other vertebrate on Earth. Scientists could not explain the axolotl for nearly 200 years. Now that they finally have, part of that secret is at risk of vanishing before we have even finished learning what it can teach us. There's a strange historical footnote here too, one that most Americans have never heard, even though it happened on their own continent's doorstep. In the 1860s, a French expedition brought a small group of live axolotls from Mexico to the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, largely for public curiosity and display. Nobody at the time understood what they were really looking at, but those Parisian axolotls quietly went on to reproduce, and an enormous share of the laboratory axolotls used in research institutions around the world today, from university biology departments to major regenerative medicine labs, are descended from that same small founding population shipped out of Mexico over 150 years ago. In other words, most of the axolotls currently teaching scientists how to potentially heal human bodies are not wild animals at all. They're the great-great-great-grandchildren of a handful of salamanders that crossed the Atlantic Ocean in the 1800s as a curiosity, long before anyone understood they were carrying one of biology's biggest secrets inside them. It also means something uncomfortable. The species best positioned to help unlock a future where humans might regrow damaged tissue could vanish from its actual native ecosystem within our lifetimes, surviving only as a captive population in tanks and laboratories, disconnected from the canals, the culture, and the mythology that gave it a name in the first place. Conservation groups working in Xochimilco are trying to change that, restoring canal habitat, monitoring water quality, and running breeding and release programs aimed at giving wild axolotls a fighting chance. Whether that effort succeeds may end up being just as important to the future of medicine as anything happening inside a research lab. So the next time you see that strange, permanently smiling, pink-faced creature in a photo or a video game, remember what is actually happening inside it. A gradient of molecules quietly telling its cells exactly where they are, a genetic circuit whispering to those cells exactly what to rebuild, a code that took science 2 centuries to even begin reading, and an animal that, despite everything it might be able to teach humanity about healing, is still fighting for its own survival. In a shrinking corner of the water it has called home since before the Aztecs ever gave it a name.